the good people who sat me at their tables. And let this child of fortune play up a jig or reel. If ever we shall meet again, be sure if you're able to keep your seat of honour reserved for an O Neill.
Arthur O'Neill was born in the townland of Drumnastrade, near Dungannon, County Tyrone, in the year 1734. When only 2 years of age, he accidentally suffered an injury to his right eye while, he remarked, diverting myself with a penknife. This accident, together with subsequent cures administered to both his eyes by quacking doctors, rendered him totally blind. As career prospects for blind children were extremely limited, Arthur's parents sent their 10-year-old son to Owen Keenan in Oher, County Tyrone, to learn to play the harp. He displayed skill for the instrument, partially because of a musical instinct, but mainly because of his instinct for survival. Just 5 years later, this young teenager began life as a wandering bard. He spent most of his adulthood travelling the island of Ireland, where he would be lauded and scorned, praised and ignored by both nobility and the not-so-noble alike. O'Neill cherished his lineage and heritage, and was a lifelong admirer not of flamboyance, sycophancy or wealth, but of the subtleties of talent, learning and decency within people, regardless of their status or social ranking. While persisting with life as a travelling bard, in his late 40s and into his 50s, he competed at 3 harping competitions in Granard, County Longford, and another in Belfast in July 1792. At the age of 74, he settled in Belfast to teach the harp. It was while in Belfast that the story of his life was penned to paper. As a relatively young man, the already much-travelled Arthur O'Neill was befriended by Michael and Elizabeth MacDonald of Cushendall, County Antrim. They had invited Arthur to reside with them and to teach the harp to their sons Alexander, Randall and, most notably, James. The friendship between the bard and the MacDonald family was to last a lifetime. Years later, James MacDonald, then a doctor in Belfast, helped to organise the Belfast Harpers' Assembly in July 1792. At this gathering, which took place in the Assembly Rooms, Belfast, a 19-year-old church organist, Edward Bunting, was commissioned to musically notate the airs played by the 11 assembled harpers. The fusion of MacDonald's foresight and Bunting's musical talent ensured that the melodies of an old and fading harping tradition were safely preserved for future generations. Later, Bunting published 3 volumes of collected airs in 1796, 1809 and in 1840. O'Neill's knowledge of his instrument was much availed of by Bunting. 2 years before the publication of the 1840 collection, some 22 years after Arthur's death, Dr. MacDonald exalted the bard in a letter. My dear Mr. Bunting, I furnish you with some particulars of my acquaintance with Arthur O'Neill. He was a man of strong natural sense, pleasing in his manners, and had acquired a considerable knowledge of the common topics, so that he could acquit himself very well in mixed society, when encouraged to converse. As to the character of O'Neill, I found him a perfectly safe companion, a man of veracity and integrity, not at all addicted to boasting or pretending to anything extraordinary. At the 1792 competition, O'Neill won second prize playing The Green Woods of Truga and Mrs. Crofton. Around half the airs played by the harpers were written by Carolan. Preferring the ancient harp music to Carolan's more modern compositions, it must be said that O'Neill respected Carolan for his creative skills and his significant contribution to the bardic tradition. Indeed, Mrs. Crofton was written by Carolan. However, while Arthur was in Belfast, Bunting collected a number of melodies from him. In 1808, at the request of the newly established Belfast Harp Society, Arthur settled in Belfast, where he was duly appointed Professor of the Harp by the Society for a salary of £30 per year. His mission was to teach the harp to young people, most of whom, like he, were blind. Content in the knowledge that they had secured the services of this experienced and knowledgeable bard, the Society, referring to themselves as they, prepared a statement for the press expressing their delight that the person whom they have been so fortunate as to procure for a master is already far advanced in life, is the only person they know now living in the kingdom capable of that office. Belfast Newsletter, 14th of June, 1808.
There's not a county in this kingdom that I haven't travelled in, and from Antrim to Berehaven, I've made many friends. Some I've met in castles, and some I've met in dungeons. And in spite of what the clergy say, we're all the same in the end. Singing Toll-a-lay, singing Toll-a-lay, my dearie-o.
Belfast's Cromick Street was the location for much harp-related activity. The Belfast Harp Society had its headquarters at number 21. Arthur O'Neill lived just a few doors away. The engraver Thomas Smith lived on this street. It was Smith who made the intricate engraving of O'Neill, which featured in various forms in Bunting's publications. Another neighbour was a nephew, perhaps cousin, of Rabbie Burns, the Bard of Ayrshire. This young man, Valentine Rainey, was one of Arthur's harp students. He later succeeded O'Neill as professor for 14 years until his untimely death at the age of just 42. It is worth noting that 3 days after Rainey's passing in 1837, the Belfast Newsletter fondly remembered both he and O'Neill, saying that Rainey was consequently placed under the care of Arthur O'Neill, who at that time had charge of the Society's pupils, and such was his proficiency that in the course of a few years he far surpassed his venerable preceptor, who was generally regarded as the most accomplished performer of his day. Belfast Newsletter, September 26, 1837. While Arthur was in Belfast, Edward Bunting's private secretary, Thomas Hughes, was commissioned to write down the story of this minstrel's life as told to him by O'Neill himself. These memoirs provide a vivid insight into not only Arthur's personality and his music, but the social and cultural climate of the time. As he recounted his stories to Hughes, he was ever conscious that his dictations could later be read by people who may be offended by his lucid recollections. True to character, he admits to not caring a pin into whose hands these unconnected memoirs may fall. The Belfast Harp Society was forever trying to find ways of raising funds to support its efforts. The Society's Minute Book provides an in-depth account of their financial hardships. The newspapers of the time, however, showed more sympathy for the now aged Arthur than the Society. The holding of subscription balls were the primary source of fundraising. These were advertised and later reported upon in newspapers such as the Belfast Commercial Chronicle and the Belfast Newsletter. After such a ball was held on Wednesday evening, the 18th of December 1809, the Belfast Commercial Chronicle reported, "O Neill, the eldest harper in Ireland, was not excluded from the festive board. In the midst of his countrymen, he seemed to have renewed his youth, presenting an interesting picture of a bard of other times, surrounded by his Milesian brethren. After dinner, he led into the room his 12 blind pupils, one of whom is female, Miss O'Reilly. Their entrance exhibited a scene peculiarly impressive, but when Miss O'Reilly and 2 of the youths strung their harps and played some trios, duets, etc., they were followed by the most enthusiastic applause. Among other admired airs were the following: Patrick's Day, The Green Woods of Truga, etc. Their performance gave much satisfaction, and it was gratifying to behold this youthful group, the objects of the Society's care, thus surrounded by their patrons, delighting their ears with music of ancient times." Belfast Commercial Chronicle, Monday, 23rd of December, 1809. The previous year, a poet from Larne, County Antrim, James McHenry, published Bard of Erin and Other Poems, in which he included an ode to Arthur O'Neill. Hark, those notes that sweetly flow, suiting well our bosoms' glow. Soft and melting now they move, like a virgin sigh of love. Fierce, impetuous, wild and strong, now they bear the soul along. 4 years later, a book of musings was especially dedicated to the Belfast Harp Society. Poetry, prose, odes, and doggerel veritably gushed forth in honour of O'Neill. A while I leave my present theme, and hail O'Neill's illustrious name, a name of yore renowned. O'Neill each bard shall sing, whene'er he strikes the trembling string. Poems on various subjects, Henry Pekin, 1812.
Dr. James and Mr. B put an end to me peregrination. They settled me here in Cromwich Street and wouldn't leave me alone. They sent the Thomas Hughes to record my lamentations and all me tales and travels since I left my dear Tyrone. Singing singing tall-a-lay, my dearie-o. Tall-a-lay, my Paradisio.
By the onset of winter, 1812, Romanticism had given way to an emerging dark, stark reality. News of how the bard was being neglected and badly treated by the society had reached the streets of Belfast. Commentators, some anonymous, some using pseudonyms, soon vented their opinions in the press. Poetic coded criticism of the Harp Society was gradually to take the form of vitriolic admonition. J.M. penned 7 verses with sublime reference to Arthur's predicament. That where the harp first poured its notes divine, our last-born bard should lean his cheek so bland on sorrow's pillow and neglected pine. For recent friendship cooled at plighted honour's shrine. From Versus, Belfast Commercial Chronicle, November 23rd, 1812. Barely 48 hours had passed when polite poetry finally gave way to slating stricture from the pen of the nom de guerre, Augustus. Reader, condescend to follow me in fancy, and I will take the liberty of showing you. Behold the venerable minstrel, with age-silvered head, whereof time has reaped a partial harvest, with brows furrowed with the cares and perplexities of 73 years, sitting in his wretched dwelling of smoke in a filthy lane off Mill Street, where all the inclemencies of the weather may enter, sooner than a ray of sunshine. Although O Neill was in fact 78 at this time, Augustus then alluded to the Society's financial promises to Arthur, claiming that they had defaulted in their payments to the bard. Your institution must have been established on a tolerably good basis when you could hold out such flattering hopes to O Neill and enter into a regular and legal contract with him, that he should receive £60 per annum for the exercise of his professional knowledge. What part or how much of this salary he has received, I know not, but I understand from what should be thought correct information that you are his debtor in no less than £160. Therefore, he could not have received very much, and truly, this sum should purchase you immortal fame. He is no longer employed. Why so? Because he has not a single pupil for instruction. It is obvious that Augustus knew Arthur, as he mentions the bard's health and his muted pride in the face of destitution. The silent, uncomplaining O Neill, a man worthy of better times, is at present not only friendless, but without pecuniary means to procure subsistence. His craving necessities, I know, would urge him to become a debtor for the common necessaries of life. But who, O inhabitants of Belfast, will be willing to credit abject poverty? Alas, you will say, too few, if any. Reflect how awkwardly and unpleasantly he is situated, living, no, half-starving in a cold, damp, smoky house, where the asthma is preying like a ravenous vulture on his decaying lungs. Hereditary and national pride forbids him to disclose his distressing tale, or let his wants be known. His manly spirit dies within him when he thinks of acknowledging his extreme poverty. He has never told me of his wants, yet I have guessed at and know them, for a true-born O Neill would be equally as reluctant to say he was hungry as to acknowledge he was conquered. Belfast Commercial Chronicle, Wednesday, 25th of November, 1812. Little information is available on either O'Neill or the Society from the time of Augustus until May 1814, when a benefit was advertised for Arthur. The introduction of this announcement is revealing in that it shows that the bard's domestic circumstances remained unchanged. Moreover, the drip effect of bad press had finally forced the Society into theatrical action. Theatre. O Neill, the Irish harper, respectfully announces to the inhabitants of Belfast that several of his friends have suggested to him, as the means of extricating himself out of distress, to try a benefit at the theatre. Belfast Commercial Chronicle, Monday, May 30th, 1814. From the revealing to what can only be described as the theatre of the absurd. This Monday night benefit for the asthmatic and impoverished bard featured the celebrated comedy of Heir at Law and concluded with an Irish jig by Mr. Bland and Mrs. Maywood. We can only hope that O'Neill was in possession of that rare gift in humour in tragedy, and more importantly, of seeing the tragedy of humour. Another week of Augustus-like abject poverty had passed when the Chronicle published a candid 15-verse poem. Perhaps this poet was a member of the audience at the benefit. Unreservedly critical of the way the now penurious O'Neill was being treated, he wrote, "'Twere better, proud Belfast, thou never hadst striven to snatch from oblivion the music of heaven. More honour were thine if thou never hadst told thy flattering tale to the minstrel of old. More praiseworthy far for thy sons had it been if Tyrone cyclist harper they never had seen. For thy specious professions were like thy design, they were false, it has failed, and dishonour is thine." The Last Minstrel by James Sylvius Law, Belfast Commercial Chronicle, Wednesday, 8th of June, 1814. The Last Minstrel was to have an extraordinary effect, as after a copy of this poem was sent to Ulstermen based in Calcutta, India, monies were sent from Calcutta to Belfast in order to establish a new harp society for the city, some 3 years after Arthur's demise. However, in the spring of 1816, the Chronicle persisted in championing Arthur's plight, in appealing to the good nature of the citizens of Belfast. Another benefit concert for the bard was announced, which requested those ladies and gentlemen of Belfast to exert themselves so as to ensure a benefit for the holy harper, reputable to the most spirited town in Ireland. In response, just 2 days later, MacM contributed some compassionate verses and a letter. "I cannot but feel an extraordinary degree of pleasure, which I hope is in common with all my fellow citizens, in understanding that a concert is to be held in the Exchange Rooms, Belfast, for the benefit of poor O'Neill, the blind Irish harper. MacM, Chronicle, 28th February, 1816. After this benefit, it was reported that Arthur was most cordially greeted on his entrance, but it was melancholy to observe the havoc time has made in his powers over his favourite instrument. Sometimes his fingers wandered through the strings like those of a child, and if he occasionally struck a chord with a master hand, it was only to show what he had once been. and seemed but like a transient gleam of brightness before the setting sun. Belfast Newsletter, 5th of March, 1816. What is noticeable from the column inches given to O'Neill's distress is the significant part played by the Belfast Commercial Chronicle. Drummond Anderson, publisher of the Chronicle, was also one of some 190 subscribers to the Belfast Harp Society when it began in 1808. His publication of these articles strongly suggests that he did not suffer from that benign condition which can sometimes afflict those involved in business and social networking, namely conflicts of interest. Shortly after the dissolution of the first Belfast Harp Society, Arthur left Belfast with his health in tatters, but with his honour intact. He died in the townland of Knocknacray, part of what is now Maydon, County Armagh, on October 29th, 1816. News of his passing was announced in Belfast 1 week later. The death notice cited that he was aged 90. Arthur was in fact 82. He was buried in Eglish churchyard, just outside Dungannon, County Tyrone. Died a few days ago at Maydon, Mr. Arthur O Neill, Professor of the Irish Harp. O'Neill was a pleasing companion, full of anecdote and historic information. In Irish genealogy, in heraldry, and in bardic lore, O'Neill was preeminent. He was better than all this, an honest, worthy man. Belfast Newsletter, November 5th, 1816. We can merely assume that the above notice was prepared and placed by the Society. This honest, worthy man, who was full of anecdote and historic information, was, perhaps, too honest and worthy to have made public, either through anecdote or information, his latter-day poverty. He was indeed better than all this. Englishman Reverend W.T. Latimer once searched the churchyard for his gravestone, but alas, with no success. In 1871, another English resident, Patrick Mallon, also tried to locate the gravesite. As if mourning, he wrote,
"Oft have I searched your graveyard to scan the tombstones old, where friar prayed and fathers famed lie in your sacred mould, and harpers sweet, whose magic notes throughout the land were known, neglected sleep in tranquil grave without a cross or stone."
From Exile Musings by Patrick Mallon. The legendary harper Carolan died in 1738, when Arthur was just 4 years of age. It was not until 1986 that a monument was erected to Carolan's memory in County Leitrim. Must we wait almost a quarter of a millennium before a suitable monument is dedicated to this bard? Whether in English or Belfast, the spirit of O'Neill would surely deserve both.
Images, 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 images.
As mentioned earlier, Arthur's Cromwick Street neighbour, Thomas Smith, made an engraving of O Neill. This engraving was actually based on an earlier portrait of him by an unknown artist. This portrait, showing the blind harper in profile sitting under a tree, was once owned by Francis Joseph Bigger. Bigger was a solicitor whose passions included history, music, and editing the Ulster Journal of Archaeology. He lived on Belfast's Antrim Road in a house he called Ardree. The contents of Ardree were sold in the 1920s. Alas, the whereabouts of both purchaser and portrait are not known. Edward Bunting's 1809 Ancient Music of Ireland featured a variation of Smith's engraving as drawn by John McCracken, Esquire, of Belfast. Another miniature version appeared in his 1840 edition. Dublin's National Gallery houses an oil-on-canvas painting of O Neill, which is very different to the Bigger, Smith, McCracken images. This portrait, painted by Con O'Donnell, depicts Arthur looking face out from frame. Con was either a son or grandson of Hugh O'Donnell. Arthur recollected that he once visited this family, most probably in the early 1780s. I next came into the county of Leitrim and came to a Cornelius O'Donnell's of Larkfield. In April 2010, I thought it only fair to Arthur's legacy and spirit that he, in some shape or fashion, should return to Belfast. I made contact with an artist, Stephen Burgess. Sending him a black and white photograph of the Con O'Donnell portrait, I asked if he would consider painting a replica of the image in colour. Stephen graciously agreed to undertake the project. With information gleaned from Arthur's memoirs and Bunting's publications, I supplied him with some details relating to O'Neill's character and dress. One such detail related to accessories on Arthur's overcoat, which were noticed and recorded by Bunting. O'Neill had his initials surmounted by the crest of the O'Neills, engraved on silver buttons the size of a half-crown. Ancient Music of Ireland, 1840. On Thursday, the 10th of June, 2010, a courier delivered the fruits of Stephen Burgess's artistry to Belfast. Thanks to his talent, learning and decency, Arthur is now back in Belfast, replete with his red hand coat buttons. Some mystery and speculation surrounds Arthur O'Neill. The precise whereabouts of his grave, his original portrait, and his harp are decidedly puzzling. The images we have of him, from Bigger's to O'Donnell's, show him playing variations of a scroll-headed harp. His memoirs mention that he played on harps other than his own. Given his long lifetime as a musical journeyman and the many people he encountered from the left to the right of affluence, it is feasible that he may have had more than one harp. Truth is, though, we don't know for certain. The novelist and harp enthusiast Lady Morgan mentioned that she once received a letter from Arthur in which he described his instrument in terms of its strings and tuning, but not of its physical shape. My harp has 36 strings of 4 kinds of wire, increasing in strength from treble to bass. From The Wild Irish Girl by Lady Morgan, 1806. Belfast's Ulster Museum presently houses a harp which, they highlight, may have belonged to Arthur. This large high-headed harp, whose painted decorations include a vignette of a human face, has a one-piece sound box with a narrow brass strip along the middle, with 39 perforations for strings, 36 brass pins survive. Though the harp is certainly of 18th century date, there is no evidence to support the traditional story that it belonged to the well-known harper Arthur O'Neill. Harp aficionado R.B. Armstrong once made a thorough examination of the Ulster Museum harp and concluded that it may once have belonged to an O'Neill, but not to Arthur. At the back of the spring of the harmonic curve, where it issues from the box, there is an incised carving of a right hand, the badge of O'Neill. There can be no doubt that this harp was at one time in the possession of O'Neill, but there is no proof that that person was Arthur O'Neill, who in the two engraved portraits is represented as playing upon a totally different instrument. Musical instruments, the Irish and Highland harps, R.B. Armstrong, 1904. London's Victoria and Albert Museum is now the home of a 41-string, including modern replacements, harp, which was originally donated to the South Kensington Museum by Archdeacon Saurin of Armagh in 1872. This instrument allegedly belonged to O'Neill. Once again, though, there is no evidence. John Bell's accounts of what possibly happened to Arthur's harp make interesting reading. Bell, originally from Scotland, became resident in Dungannon, possibly in the early 1800s. He kept a notebook of anecdotes and stories on Irish musical instruments, including notes on some harpers. In 1849, he met a blind harper called Patrick Byrne. On July 9th of that year, Byrne, a former student of the Second Harp Society, gave a harp recital in Dungannon. While in the town, he related a story to Bell which told of a fracas at the Harp Society's house in Belfast between Valentine Rainey's spouse and some of the harp students, one of whom was a Samuel Patrick. Byrne recalls, "Arthur O'Neill's harp was burned by Samuel Patrick, a bad harper, in the Harp Society house. That harp afterwards belonged to Rainey the harper. Patrick and others had taken umbrage at Rainey's wife. It was burned as a bonfire, because Rainey's wife had gone out of the house. The brass tuning pins were picked out of Rainey's harp and O'Neill's, and they sold them for drink." From domestic disputes, mystery, speculation, and lack of evidence, we move swiftly to intrigue. The disturbances and descriptions thereof are mostly amiss from Arthur's recollections, most probably as a result of his age-related diplomacy. Raymond O'Murray accessed a revealing transcript of a 1798 court-martial in which one Ferdinand O'Neill, as prosecutor, struggled in vain in the pursuit of justice in the wake of a horrific crime visited upon his family on July 7th of that year. Ferdinand was the bard's brother, much alluded to in Arthur's memoirs. O'Murray highlights that this transcript contains information relating not only to Arthur's harp. I think it is clear from the evidence of the court that Arthur had a son who lived in Ferdinand's house. James Laverty, Ferdinand's servant, who also stayed in the house, refers to his brother's son. Mr. Best Fair, a neighbour, speaks of a boy he supposes to be O'Neill's nephew, and there was a harp in the house, the property of a blind man, O'Neill's brother, who made his livelihood by it. We learn from the court-martial that Ferdinand's wife, while in bed, was fatally wounded by the Moy yeomanry soon after arriving at their home. Ferdinand, in shock, fainted. Their home set ablaze. Whether Arthur's scroll-headed harp survived, again, we don't know. One thing we do know, however, is that Arthur O'Neill's contribution to the bardic tradition was lengthy, rich, and extraordinary. The recounting and sharing of his life with the people of Belfast surely should not be forgotten.
There's not a county in this kingdom that I haven't travelled in, and from Antrim to Berehaven, sure I've made many friends. Some I've met in castles, and some I've met in dungeons. And in spite of what the clergy say, we're all the same in the end. Singing toll-all-lay, singing toll-all-lay, my dearie-o. Toll-all-lay, toll-lay, my daisy-o. Here's health to the good people who sat me at their tables. And let this child of fortune play up a jig or reel. If ever we shall meet again, be sure if you're able to keep your seat of honour reserved for an O Neill.